quiet bedroom in Garden Grove. A road near a Marine base. Two women 2 years apart. And for more than 3 decades, no answers. Welcome to True Crime Headquarters. Tonight, we explore some unsettling stories where appearances concealed something far darker. Take a moment to settle in. Breathe slowly. Let the outside world fade. This is the story of the silent witness. The murders of Shannon Lloyd and Renee Cuevas. Now let's begin. In the spring of 1987, Garden Grove, California was the kind of place where people knew their neighbors. Modest homes lined tidy streets in this Orange County community, where families barbecued on weekends and kids rode bikes until the streetlights came on. It was ordinary in the way that made people feel safe, the way that made what happened next feel impossible. Shannon Rose Lloyd was 23 years old that May. Her brother Tom would later describe her as tough, someone who wasn't scared of much. Friends remembered her adventurous spirit, the way she loved horses, the tomboy energy that made her stand out. She worked hard. She rented a bedroom in a house on a quiet Garden Grove street, building the kind of independent life young people dream about when they're starting out. If you enjoy listening and would like to find this channel again, you're welcome to subscribe. On the evening of May 21st, 1987, someone entered Shannon's rented room. What happened there would remain hidden for decades, locked inside forensic evidence that technology hadn't yet learned to read. When she was discovered, the medical examiner's findings told a story of violence. She had been strangled. The investigation began immediately, as it always does in cases like these. Detectives canvassed the neighborhood, interviewed everyone who knew her, followed every thread they could find. They collected evidence from the scene, including biological material that would one day prove crucial. But in 1987, DNA technology was still in its infancy. The evidence existed, but the tools to decode it properly did not. The case files grew thick with reports, witness statements, dead ends. Shannon's family waited for answers that never came. Her brother Tom struggled to understand how someone could take a life and simply walk away. The investigation continued for months, then years, but slowly the leads dried up. Detectives moved on to newer cases, though Shannon's file remained open on the shelves of the Garden Grove Police Department. In the language of law enforcement, the case went cold. Life continued in Orange County. Seasons changed. The 1980s gave way to the 1990s. Shannon's family carried their grief through birthdays she would never celebrate, through holidays that felt incomplete. And then, in February 1989, almost 2 years after Shannon's death, another young woman's life ended along a roadside near the El Toro Marine Base. Renee Cuevas was 27 years old. She had a son who was, according to her cousin Yolanda Louie, her pride and joy. Renee was the kind of mother who always had gifts ready for her child. Candies, clothes, toys. Her family remembered her dimples, the way her whole face changed when she smiled. Her cousin would later say that if she could speak to Renee again, she would make her laugh, just to see those dimples one more time. On the morning of February 19, 1989, Renee's body was discovered along Lambert Road, not far from what was then Marine Corps Air Station El Toro. The area was semi-rural, the kind of place where someone could disappear from view. There were no witnesses to what had happened. Like Shannon's case, the investigation began with urgency. Unlike Shannon's case, investigators this time had something else to work with. They had learned from experience. They collected evidence meticulously, including biological samples that might one day tell them who had done this. But as with Shannon, the technology of the time couldn't provide the answers they needed. The killer had left traces of himself behind, invisible fingerprints written in genetic code, but the dictionary to translate that code simply didn't exist yet. Renee's family, her son, her grandmother Mercedes known as Amma, her 4 siblings, her Aunt Amelia, her cousin Yolanda, all waited for justice, for closure, for the simple human need to know why. 2 young women, both in their 20s, both living in Orange County, both killed within a span of 2 years. The crimes bore certain similarities that troubled investigators, but without the ability to definitively link them, each case stood alone. Shannon's file gathered dust in Garden Grove. Renee's file did the same with the Orange County Sheriff's Department. The families mourned. The communities moved on the way communities must. But the questions remained, patient and persistent, waiting for technology to catch up to tragedy. In those years between the late 1980s and the turn of the millennium, forensic science was undergoing a revolution. DNA profiling, once a theoretical concept, was becoming a practical tool. Databases were being built, methodologies refined. In California, as elsewhere, law enforcement agencies were beginning to understand that old evidence might hold new answers. Cold cases, they realized, weren't necessarily closed cases. They were just waiting. By the early 2000s, Orange County had established a crime lab capable of advanced DNA analysis. Technicians began the painstaking work of reviewing old evidence, testing samples that had been preserved for years. In 2003, something remarkable happened. A forensic scientist examining evidence from Shannon Lloyd's 1987 murder identified a male DNA profile. It was clear, definable, unique. Then they turned to the evidence from Renee Cuevas's 1989 murder. And there it was again, the same profile, the same person. After 16 years, investigators finally knew something crucial. Shannon and Renee had been killed by the same man. The cases were connected. Somewhere out there was a person who had murdered at least twice, someone who had walked free since 1989. The urgency returned. Detectives ran the profile through every database available. They checked CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system, which contained genetic information on convicted offenders and arrestees. They searched local databases, state databases, national databases. Nothing matched. The killer's DNA wasn't in any system. He had either never been arrested, or he had been arrested before DNA collection became standard practice. The connection between the cases was a breakthrough, but it led nowhere. The families still waited. Shannon's brother Tom, Renee's cousin Yolanda, and her son, now grown, resembling his mother, carrying her absence with him. All continued living with questions that had no answers. The man who had killed Shannon and Renee remained unknown, his identity locked inside those genetic markers that matched no one in any database in America. The early 2000s became the 2010s. Technology continued advancing, but the cases remained unsolved. And in Orange County, in the offices of the district attorney and the Garden Grove Police Department, Shannon Lloyd's and Renee Cuevas's files remained open, waiting for the next innovation that might finally reveal a name. Las Vegas in the late 1990s was a city of constant transformation, where people came to reinvent themselves, to disappear into crowds and bright lights. Among those who had relocated there from Southern California was a man named Reuben J. Smith. Born in Michigan, Smith had lived in Orange County throughout the 1980s before making the move to Nevada. To anyone who knew him casually, he would have seemed ordinary. One more person trying to make a life in a city built on chance and fresh starts. What happened in Las Vegas in July 1998 would eventually change everything, though it would take more than 2 decades for those connections to become clear. A woman was attacked. The details were horrific enough that they don't need explicit recounting here, but what matters is this. She fought. In a situation where many might have frozen or succumbed, she fought back with everything she had. She would later describe sensing that if she didn't resist, she wouldn't survive. She felt the intent radiating from her attacker, the certainty that he meant to kill her. Her resistance worked. She escaped, injured, traumatized, but alive. The Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department responded quickly. Smith was arrested and charged with sexual assault and attempted murder. As part of the booking process, as was increasingly becoming standard procedure by the late 1990s, a DNA sample was taken. The charges were later dismissed. The reasons remain unclear from public records, but the DNA sample remained on file, stored in a database, a genetic signature waiting to be matched to something else. The woman who survived that 1998 attack would carry those memories for the rest of her life. Years later, When investigators finally contacted her about the resolution of Shannon Lloyd's and Renee Cuevas's cases, she spoke about her experience. She described her attacker's behavior, the things he said, the way he told her explicitly that he was going to kill her. She emphasized the darkness she perceived in him, something beyond ordinary violence. Even decades later, the encounter haunted her. But she had done something crucial. She had survived. And in surviving, in fighting back hard enough to escape, she had provided law enforcement with evidence that would eventually solve 2 murders. Reuben Smith did not face trial for the 1998 attack. In 1999, at the age of 39, he died by suicide. Whatever demons he carried, whatever motivated his violence against women, he took with him. His death was noted in Las Vegas records but made no particular impact beyond his immediate circle. He left behind no explanation, no confession, no accounting for his actions. Just silence and, unknown to anyone at the time, 2 unsolved murders in Orange County, California. The years passed. The technology of forensic genealogy continued developing, but it remained a specialized tool used primarily in academic settings. Then, in April 2018, everything changed. In Sacramento County, California, investigators announced the arrest of Joseph James DeAngelo, the Golden State Killer. For decades, DeAngelo had been one of the most sought-after serial offenders in American history, linked to at least 13 murders, more than 50 rapes, and over 100 burglaries across California. Traditional investigative methods had failed to identify him. His DNA was in evidence but matched nothing in any criminal database. The breakthrough came through investigative genetic genealogy. Investigators uploaded the Golden State Killer's DNA profile to GEDmatch, a public genealogy database where people voluntarily submit their genetic information to find relatives and build family trees. The database found matches, not to DeAngelo himself, but to distant relatives who had submitted their DNA for entirely innocent purposes, seeking to understand their ancestry. Using those matches, investigative genetic genealogists built family trees, working forward through generations to identify potential suspects. The process was painstaking, requiring expertise in both genetics and genealogy. But it worked. It led them to Joseph James DeAngelo, and his arrest made international headlines. The implications rippled through law enforcement nationwide. If the Golden State Killer could be identified through his family's DNA, how many other cold cases might be solvable using the same technique? How many families waiting for answers might finally get them? How many violent offenders, long dead or living anonymously, might finally be named? Orange County District Attorney Todd Spitzer paid attention. In response to the Golden State Killer's arrest, his office established an investigative genetic genealogy unit, one of the first such dedicated teams in the country. The unit's mission was to review cold cases with biological evidence and determine which might benefit from this new methodology. The work required collaboration between law enforcement, forensic scientists, and professional genealogists who understood how to navigate the complex world of genetic family trees. Shannon Lloyd's case and Renee Cuevas's case were obvious candidates. The DNA evidence was strong, properly preserved, and clearly linked to a single suspect. In 2021, the IGG team took on the cases. They extracted the genetic profile that had been sitting in evidence for decades and uploaded it to genealogical databases. Then they waited to see what connections might emerge. The process of investigative genetic genealogy is methodical and time-consuming. When a DNA profile is uploaded to a public database, it's compared against all the profiles already there, looking for shared genetic segments that indicate family relationships. Close relatives, parents, siblings, children share large amounts of DNA. More distant relatives, third cousins, fourth cousins, share smaller segments. By identifying multiple relatives at different degrees of connection, genealogists can triangulate the position of an unknown person on a family tree. In Shannon and Renee's cases, the database returned matches. Not close relatives, but distant ones, people separated by several generations from the unknown suspect. The genetic genealogists began the painstaking work of building family trees, using the matches as anchor points. They researched birth records, marriage licenses, census data, obituaries, anything that could help them understand how these families connected. They worked forward through time, identifying children and grandchildren, mapping out who lived where and when. Eventually, patterns emerged. The family trees pointed toward certain branches, certain individuals who lived in Southern California during the 1980s. The list of potential suspects narrowed. And then a name surfaced: Reuben J. Smith. Born in Michigan, resident of Orange County in the 1980s, moved to Las Vegas in the 1990s. Died in 1999, and crucially, arrested in Las Vegas in 1998, which meant his DNA would be on file. The investigators made the connection to the Las Vegas arrest. They requested Smith's DNA profile from the Nevada database. When they compared it to the profile from Shannon Lloyd's and Renee Cuevas's murder scenes, they had their answer. It was a perfect match. After 34 years, Shannon's killer had a name. After 32 years, Renee's killer had a name. They were the same person, Reuben J. Smith. But the identification raised as many questions as it answered. Who was Reuben Smith? What had driven him to violence? Had there been other victims between 1987 and 1989, or before or after? Why had he left Orange County for Las Vegas? The surviving victim from 1998 represented at least a third attack, suggesting a pattern that might extend beyond what was known. Smith had lived in Orange County throughout the entire 1980s. What else had he done during those years? Investigators began reviewing other unsolved cases from the same era, looking for potential connections. They put out public appeals for anyone who might have information about Smith's activities, his movements, his associations. But Smith had been dead for more than 2 decades. Many who might have known him had died themselves or moved away. Memory fades, details blur. The picture of who Reuben Smith had been remained frustratingly incomplete. What was clear was this: from at least 1987 to 1998, Smith had posed a danger to women. 3 known victims, 2 dead, 1 who survived. Possibly more that were never reported or never connected. He had lived among regular people, maintaining whatever facade allowed him to move through society without raising alarm. And then, a year after his Las Vegas arrest, he had taken his own life, closing off any possibility that he would ever answer for what he had done. On July 25, 2022, the Garden Grove Police Department and the Orange County District Attorney's Office held a press conference. The room was filled with reporters, cameras, and most importantly, family members who had waited more than 3 decades for this moment. Among them was Tom Lloyd, Shannon's older brother, and Yolanda Louie, Renee's cousin. On easels stood photographs of Shannon and Renee, frozen at ages they had never gotten to surpass. Deputy Police Chief Amir El-Farah spoke first, outlining the basics of the cases and the investigative journey that had finally led to resolution. His words were careful, respectful of the gravity of what was being announced. District Attorney Todd Spitzer followed, emphasizing the dedication of the multiple generations of investigators who had worked these cases. He spoke about how justice doesn't have an expiration date, how advances in science combined with relentless detective work had finally provided answers. Then he said the name Reuben J. Smith, the man responsible for the deaths of Shannon Lloyd and Renee Cuevas. Dead since 1999 but now identified, his crimes no longer anonymous. For Tom Lloyd, the news brought a complex mixture of relief and continuing grief. In prepared remarks read at the conference, he talked about his sister's toughness, her fearlessness. He expressed gratitude for the work of the investigators, for the advances in DNA science that had made the identification possible. But he also articulated the central agony that resolution can't fully heal. The difficulty of comprehending how someone can take another person's life and simply discard them. Knowing who killed Shannon didn't bring her back. It didn't explain why she had been targeted. It didn't restore the decades of life she should have had. Yolanda Louie spoke at the conference as well, choosing to focus not on the man who had killed her cousin but on Renee herself. She described Renee's dimples, her love for her son, the kind of unconditional devotion only a mother can give. She talked about how Renee would always have gifts ready for her child, how he had her wrapped around his finger. She spoke about the family that had loved Renee, grandmother Mercedes, Aunt Amelia, the 4 siblings, most of whom had passed away without ever knowing who had killed her. The resolution came too late for them. But for those who remained, including Renee's son who had grown up without his mother, there was at least the answer to the fundamental question. Who? The press conference also addressed the 1998 Las Vegas attack. The surviving victim, who chose to remain anonymous, had provided a statement that was read at the conference. Her words carried the weight of lived trauma. She described the fear she had felt, the certainty that she would die if she didn't fight. She talked about the things Smith had said, the explicit threats, and she emphasized the lasting impact, acknowledging that even more than 2 decades later, the attack continued to haunt her. But her resistance had saved her life and, ultimately, helped solve 2 murders. Her courage had created the DNA evidence that made Smith's eventual identification possible. The announcement generated significant media coverage, both locally in Orange County and nationally. The case became one more example of how investigative genetic genealogy was revolutionizing cold case investigations. By 2022, according to prosecutors, approximately 400 cold cases nationwide had been solved using this technique. Orange County alone had solved 4 cold case homicides through IgG, including Shannon's and Renee's. But for all the technological achievement, for all the investigative skill, certain questions remained unanswered. Why had Smith killed Shannon Lloyd? What were the circumstances of Renee Cuevas's death? How had he selected his victims? What happened in the years between 1989 and 1998? Had there been other victims who were never connected or never reported? These questions couldn't be answered because the person who knew the answers had been dead for 23 years. Investigators issued appeals for anyone with information about Smith's time in Orange County to come forward. They wanted to know about his movements, his habits, his associations. They wanted to know if there were other cases that might be connected. The investigation wasn't closed in the sense that Smith would face trial. Death had made that impossible. But investigators wanted to provide as complete a picture as possible for the families and to ensure that any other potential crimes were identified. The scientific process that identified Smith was both cutting-edge and controversial. Investigative genetic genealogy relies on public genealogy databases, where people upload their DNA seeking to understand their ancestry and find relatives. Those people don't consent to their genetic information being used in criminal investigations. They're simply trying to learn about their family history. Yet their DNA becomes a tool to identify distant relatives who might be criminal suspects. Supporters of IgG argue that it's a powerful tool for justice, one that solves cases that would otherwise remain forever unsolved. They point to the Golden State Killer, to Shannon Lloyd, to Renee Cuevas, to hundreds of other cases where families finally got answers. They emphasize that the technique only identifies suspects who are then confirmed through traditional DNA evidence collected via search warrant or from discarded items. The genealogy database just points investigators in the right direction. Critics raise concerns about privacy, about the creation of a genetic surveillance network where anyone's DNA, once uploaded for innocent purposes, can be used to investigate their relatives. They worry about mission creep, about the expansion of databases, about the potential for abuse. Some genealogy companies have responded by implementing stricter policies about law enforcement access, requiring that users opt in to allowing their data to be searched for investigative purposes. But for Tom Lloyd and Yolanda Louie, for Renee's son, for the surviving victim in Las Vegas, the ethical debates were secondary to the fundamental reality. They finally had answers. Imperfect answers, incomplete answers, but answers nonetheless. They knew who had killed Shannon and Renee. They knew it wasn't some random stranger who might still be out there, unknown and unpunished. The name was Reuben J. Smith. The DNA said so with scientific certainty. The press conference concluded with statements from law enforcement officials emphasizing their commitment to continuing to work cold cases, to using every tool available to bring resolution to families. Garden Grove Police Chief Tom Dare specifically mentioned the ongoing partnership with the district attorney's IgG unit and the potential to solve many more cold cases in the future. Sheriff Don Barnes spoke about the dedication to seeking answers no matter how much time had passed. And then the families left, carrying with them the knowledge they had sought for more than 30 years. The knowledge of who, if not quite the knowledge of why. The closure of identification, if not the closure of comprehension. Justice in the only form it could take when the perpetrator was long dead. In the months following the July 2022 announcement, the story of Shannon Lloyd and Renee Cuevas became part of a larger narrative about the transformation of cold case investigation. Articles were written, television segments produced, discussions held about the intersection of genealogy, privacy, and justice. The cases were cited as examples of both the promise and the peril of new investigative technologies. But beyond the headlines and policy debates, there were human lives attempting to move forward with difficult knowledge. Tom Lloyd had spent 35 years wondering who had killed his sister. Now he knew. The knowing didn't erase the loss, didn't restore Shannon to life, didn't give back the decades she should have had. But it provided a different kind of closure. The closure of certainty, of no longer wondering if the killer might be someone he passed on the street, of no longer imagining that the person responsible was living free and unpunished. For Renee's family, the revelation came even later, 33 years after her death. Many who had loved her most, her grandmother Mercedes, her Aunt Amelia, her siblings, had died without ever knowing who had killed her. Yolanda Louie and others who remained carried the knowledge for them, a sacred responsibility to remember and to witness. And somewhere, Renee's son, now in his 40s, the age his mother had never reached, had to integrate this information into his understanding of the loss that had shaped his entire life. The surviving victim from Las Vegas, whose name remained protected from public disclosure, faced her own reckoning. For 24 years, she had lived knowing that she had been attacked, that she had barely escaped, but not knowing if her attacker had hurt others. Now she knew. Shannon Lloyd had died 11 years before the Las Vegas attack. Renee Cuevas had died 9 years before. If the survivor had any guilt about not being able to prevent those deaths, guilt that would be logically unfounded but emotionally understandable, she had to work through it. If she found some measure of peace in knowing that her resistance had ultimately helped identify Smith, that peace was complicated by the knowledge of what he had done to others. Investigators continued reviewing other unsolved cases from Orange County in the 1980s and 1990s, looking for potential connections to Smith. They examined patterns, methods, locations, victim characteristics, searching for similarities. They reached out to law enforcement agencies in Las Vegas and other places Smith had lived, checking for unsolved crimes that might match his profile. This work continues, quiet and methodical, driven by the possibility that there might be other families waiting for answers. The investigative genetic genealogy technique that solved these cases has continued to advance. Databases have grown, containing millions of genetic profiles. Algorithms have improved, better at identifying distant relationships and building family trees. More law enforcement agencies have established their own IgG units or contracted with private genealogy firms that specialize in investigative work. The technique has spread internationally, solving cold cases in countries around the world. But the growth has also intensified privacy debates. In 2019, GEDmatch, the database crucial to solving the Golden State Killer case, changed its policy to require users to opt in to allowing law enforcement searches. The number of searchable profiles immediately dropped from over 1 million to around 100,000. Other databases implemented similar restrictions, attempting to balance the legitimate privacy concerns of users with the investigative potential of their data. The debates continue in scientific journals, law reviews, ethics committees, and legislative chambers. For investigative genetic genealogy practitioners, these cases represent both triumph and burden. The triumph of solving seemingly impossible cases, of giving families long-sought answers. The burden of knowing that success depends on people's voluntary participation in genealogy databases, and that restrictions on access might mean some cases will never be solved. They work in a liminal space between cutting-edge science and fundamental human needs, between data privacy and justice for victims. The Orange County District Attorney's Office has continued its commitment to reviewing cold cases through the IgG lens, District Attorney Spitzer has spoken frequently about the importance of this work, about the promise that no case is truly cold anymore, that every case with biological evidence is potentially solvable. His office has devoted resources to the effort, understanding that solving decades-old cases serves multiple purposes. It provides answers to families, it brings closure to open investigations, and it demonstrates to communities that justice perseveres. There's something philosophically profound about solving a murder when both victim and perpetrator are long dead. The traditional purposes of criminal justice, punishment, deterrence, rehabilitation, become impossible. The killer can't be imprisoned, can't be made to face his victims' families in court, can't be sentenced or compelled to explain himself. Death has granted him a permanent escape from earthly accountability. What remains is the accounting itself, the naming, the acknowledgement, the formal recognition of what was done and who did it. Some might argue this is insufficient, that justice requires the possibility of punishment. Others would contend that truth itself has value, that naming the guilty serves important social and psychological functions even when legal penalties are impossible. For the families of Shannon Lloyd and Renee Cuevas, these aren't abstract philosophical questions. They're lived realities. They have to decide for themselves what this resolution means, how to incorporate it into their ongoing grief, what to do with the knowledge they now possess. The story raises questions about the nature of evil, about the men who hurt women and what drives them. Reuben Smith's motivations died with him, leaving only speculation. Was he driven by impulse or compulsion? Did he target his victims deliberately or opportunistically? What happened in his life that led him to violence? These questions can't be answered definitively, and perhaps that's a small mercy. Sometimes knowing too much about the mechanism of violence doesn't help the healing process. What we do know is that Smith's violence spanned at least 11 years, from Shannon's death in 1987 to his attack in Las Vegas in 1998. We know that he lived in Orange County throughout the 1980s, a period that encompasses both murders. We know that he then moved to Las Vegas, where he attacked at least one more woman before taking his own life. This timeline suggests a sustained pattern, not a momentary loss of control. It suggests calculation, repetition, perhaps escalation. And we know there was at least one person who survived him, who fought back hard enough to escape, who provided the evidence that would eventually solve 2 murders. Her courage, exercised in a moment of existential terror, had consequences that extended decades into the future. That's worth acknowledging, worth remembering. Sometimes resistance matters in ways we can't immediately perceive. In the years since the announcement, life has continued for those touched by these cases. Tom Lloyd still lives with the absence of his sister, but now with the knowledge of who took her away. Yolanda Louis carries Renee's memory, along with the faces of all the family members who died before getting answers. Renee's son moves through his life, shaped by a loss that occurred when he was very young, now supplemented by information he didn't have before. The Las Vegas survivor continues her own journey, working through trauma that time diminishes but doesn't erase. And in Orange County, in the evidence rooms and case files of law enforcement agencies, other cold cases wait. Other families wait. The promise of investigative genetic genealogy is that some of these cases, maybe many of them, are solvable. The biological evidence exists, preserved and cataloged. The technology exists, refined and improving. The databases exist, containing millions of genetic profiles. What's needed is time, resources, expertise, and the continued willingness of people to upload their DNA for genealogical purposes, unknowingly becoming potential keys to unlock decades-old mysteries. Shannon Rose Lloyd was 23 years old when she died in May 1987. She loved horses and had an adventurous spirit. Her brother remembered her as tough and fearless. She should have had 50, 60, maybe 70 more years of life. She should have had the chance to continue being the person she was becoming, to make whatever mark on the world she was meant to make. That opportunity was stolen from her. Renee Cuevas was 27 when she died in February 1989. She had a son she adored, dimples that lit up her face when she smiled, and a family that loved her deeply. She should have watched her son grow up, should have been there for graduations and weddings and grandchildren. She should have grown old surrounded by people who cared about her. That future was taken from her. The resolution of their cases doesn't give back what was lost. Can't. But it provides something that matters: acknowledgement, recognition, the formal establishment of truth. It says that Shannon Lloyd and Renee Cuevas were not forgotten, that their deaths were not mysteries that could be allowed to remain unsolved forever. That even decades later, even when the perpetrator had escaped earthly justice through his own death, the work of naming and accounting would continue until completion. In July 2022, more than 30 years after these women died, their families finally learned the name of the person responsible. Reuben J. Smith. Not a ghost, not an unknown suspect, not an unsolvable mystery. A specific person whose DNA betrayed him long after his death, whose violence against women could finally be documented and acknowledged. The science had caught up. The dedication had persisted. The answers had come. This is what investigative genetic genealogy offers. Not the restoration of what was lost, not the punishment of the guilty, but the recovery of truth. The ability to say, finally and with certainty, this is what happened. This is who did it. For some, that's enough. For others, it's just the beginning of a new phase of processing and healing. But for all involved, it's better than the alternative, better than never knowing, better than the eternal uncertainty, better than leaving these women's deaths as unsolved mysteries. Their names are Shannon Rose Lloyd and Renee Cuevas. They lived. They were loved. They were killed by Reuben J. Smith. And now, finally, the world knows. If you're new here, welcome to the channel, where we dive into true crime stories with calmness and respect. A special shout out to my amazing subscribers who've been with me from the start. Thank you for your incredible support. If you're still with me, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. Or just say hello so I know you're still here. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and hit subscribe so you won't miss any of our upcoming true crime stories perfect for winding down. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2. The Investor Murders. A true crime documentary. Someone waved from the deck that morning. In the fog off Craig, Alaska, another fisherman noticed it. A man steering the investor away from the docks, casual as anyone else preparing for the day's work. The gesture was so ordinary that it barely registered. By the time the flames appeared the following afternoon, that wave had become something else entirely. A moment that should have meant nothing had become the last known movement of a crime scene drifting into the mist, carrying with it 8 bodies and a mystery that would consume investigators, devastate 2 communities, and remain unsolved for more than 4 decades. This is the story of what happened aboard the fishing vessel Investor in September 1982, and why, despite 2 trials and years of investigation, no one has ever been held accountable for Alaska's worst mass homicide. Craig, Alaska, sits on Prince of Wales Island, the 4th largest island in the United States. In 1982, the town had a population of roughly 600 permanent residents, though that number swelled considerably during fishing season. The community existed in a kind of isolation that's difficult to comprehend from the outside, accessible only by plane or boat, separated from Juneau by 220 miles of cold Pacific water and dense wilderness. It was a place where everyone knew the boats in the harbor, where the arrival and departure of vessels marked the rhythm of daily life. The commercial fishing industry in southeast Alaska was, and remains, the economic backbone of communities like Craig. During the late 1970s and early 1980s, salmon prices reached historic highs. A successful season could earn a captain and crew $500,000 or more in just 3 months of intense, dangerous work. The money attracted young men from the Pacific Northwest, primarily from Washington state, who would arrive each spring ready to work 18-hour days in brutal conditions for a share of the catch. The work demanded physical endurance, mental toughness, and the ability to function with minimal sleep in a confined space with strangers who quickly became either trusted partners or bitter adversaries. Mark Colthurst understood this world intimately. Born in 1954, he had begun commercial fishing at 16 years old, displaying an almost preternatural ability to read the water, anticipate salmon runs, and maximize catches. By the time he reached his late 20s, Colthurst had earned a reputation as one of the most skilled and successful fishermen working out of Bellingham and Blaine, Washington. He was known for his work ethic, his ambition, and his frank assessment of his own abilities. He told people openly that he planned to retire by age 50, and those who knew him believed it. In late 1981 or early 1982, Colthurst made a move that few fishermen his age could contemplate. He purchased a state-of-the-art fishing vessel for approximately $750,000 to $850,000. The boat was a 58-foot fiberglass purse seiner, a specialized vessel designed for catching salmon by surrounding schools of fish with a large net that could be drawn closed like a purse. He named it the Investor, a title that reflected both his business acumen and his view of the fishing industry as something more than seasonal labor. This was an investment in his future, in his family's security. Mark was married to Irene Colthurst, also 28 years old, and they had 2 young children, 5-year-old Kimberly, who was about to start kindergarten, and 4-year-old John. In September 1982, Irene was 3 months pregnant with their 3rd child. The Colthurst family came from Blaine, Washington, a small town just south of the Canadian border, part of the tight-knit fishing community that supplied much of the labor for Alaska's summer salmon season. For the 1982 season, Mark had hired 4 young crewmen, all in their late teens. 3 were from the Blaine area and had connections to the Colthurst family. Michael Stewart, 19, was Mark's cousin and a sophomore at Washington State University. Jerome Keown, 19, was an honor student at Seattle University known for his academic dedication. Dean Moon, 19, was a former Blaine High School football star. The 4th crewman was Chris Heyman, 18, from San Rafael, California, a friend of the Colthurst family. September 6, 1982, would have been Chris Heyman's 18th birthday. The dynamic aboard a fishing boat during salmon season is intense and insular. Crews work together in cramped quarters for weeks at a time, developing bonds forged through shared exhaustion and shared success. But the same environment that creates camaraderie can also amplify conflicts. Small disagreements become magnified. Personality clashes that might be minor irritations on land can become intolerable at sea. Captains hold absolute authority, and their decisions about work assignments, division of catch shares, and crew discipline can create resentments that linger long after a season ends. Mark Colthurst was known to run a tight operation. Some described him as confident to the point of arrogance, someone who knew his worth and wasn't afraid to show it. He had high standards for his crew and little patience for those who didn't meet them. By most accounts, he could be difficult to work for, demanding excellence and quick to terminate crew members who fell short. This approach had contributed to his success, but it had also left behind a trail of young men who felt they'd been treated unfairly, who nursed grievances about being fired or passed over or blamed for mistakes they believed weren't entirely their fault. In previous seasons, Colthurst had employed other crewmen who came and went from his boats. One of them was John Kenneth Peel, a fisherman from Bellingham, Washington, who had worked for Colthurst during the 1980 and 1981 seasons aboard a vessel called the Kit. The working relationship had ended badly. According to various accounts, Peel was fired by Colthurst, allegedly for issues related to drug and alcohol use. Peel had never worked aboard the Investor, and by 1982 had moved on to crew for another boat. There was also a personal connection. Peel had dated Irene Colthurst's sister in a relationship that reportedly ended on difficult terms. These details would seem minor at the time. The routine churn of seasonal workers, romantic relationships that didn't work out, the everyday friction of the fishing industry. But they would later become central to the investigation, examined and re-examined for signs of motive, for evidence of anger deep enough to explain what was about to happen. On the afternoon of Sunday, September 5, 1982, the Investor pulled into Craig's North Harbor and tied up alongside 2 other seiners, the Decade and the Defiant. The salmon season was winding down, and the atmosphere in town carried the particular energy of fishermen who had worked hard all summer and were now beginning to think about heading home. That evening, the Colthurst family went to Ruth Ann's restaurant in Craig to celebrate two things: Mark's 28th birthday and the approaching end of what had been, by all accounts, a successful fishing season. Several people in the restaurant that night would later remember seeing the family. Mark and Irene appeared relaxed, their children well-behaved. The crew was in good spirits. They finished their meal and left the restaurant shortly before 10 o'clock in the evening, walking back toward the harbor in the dark. It was the last time anyone saw them alive. At approximately 6:30 on the morning of Monday, September 6th, a crewman aboard the Decade noticed something unusual. The investor was slowly drifting away from the dock, as if the boats had somehow become disconnected and the current was pulling the larger vessel out toward the harbor entrance. When he investigated, he discovered that the investor's expensive tie-down lines, the heavy ropes that had secured it to the Decade, had been left behind on the Decade's deck. This struck him as strange. Tie-down lines were valuable, and no captain would deliberately leave them behind. More importantly, the lines hadn't simply come loose. Someone had deliberately untied them. The morning was thick with fog, a common condition in southeast Alaska during September. Visibility was limited to a few dozen yards at best. A few other fishermen noticed the investor moving through the harbor around this time, idling slowly as if someone were carefully navigating away from the docks. At least one witness reported seeing a figure at the helm who waved in acknowledgement as another boat passed. The gesture seemed entirely normal, one fisherman acknowledging another in the routine choreography of harbor life. The investor continued moving until it reached Fish Egg Island, a small landmass on the west side of Prince of Wales Island, roughly a mile from Craig's harbor. There, someone anchored the vessel. The water in that location was deep, well over 100 feet. It would have been a logical place to sink a boat permanently. Monday passed quietly in Craig. The fog that had blanketed the area in the morning persisted through much of the day. Fishing vessels came and went. The few hundred people who lived in town went about their routines. No one reported seeing the investor or anyone associated with it. The absence wasn't immediately concerning. It wasn't unusual for a boat to leave harbor without announcement, especially near the end of the season. On Tuesday afternoon, September 7th, the fog began to lift. A crewman aboard a fishing vessel called the Casino was scanning the water when he noticed smoke rising from the direction of Fish Egg Island. As visibility improved, the source became clear. A large fishing boat was on fire, flames consuming its superstructure, black smoke pouring into the afternoon sky. The Casino crew immediately radioed authorities in Craig and began motoring toward the burning vessel. As they approached, they could see it was the investor. The fire was intense, centered near the wheelhouse and forward cabin area. The boat itself appeared to be settling lower in the water, as if taking on significant amounts of flooding. The Casino crew attempted to get close enough to fight the fire or check for survivors, but the heat was too intense, forcing them to keep their distance. Within a short time, Alaska State Troopers, the Craig Police Department, and volunteer firefighters from the town arrived on the scene. For several hours, they battled the flames, which burned with such ferocity that responders initially couldn't get within 50 feet of the vessel. The fire's intensity and the continued settling of the boat suggested this was more than a simple accident. 2 Coast Guard dewatering pumps were brought in to prevent the investor from sinking entirely, and by late evening on September 7th, the fire was mostly extinguished. The gutted hull was towed to the beach on Fish Egg Island. Even from a distance, the damage was catastrophic. The wheelhouse and forward sections had been almost completely consumed. What remained was a blackened shell, the interior reduced to ash and twisted metal. That night, investigators began the grim work of searching through the wreckage. Almost immediately, they found human remains. 4 bodies were discovered in the ashes near where the wheelhouse had stood. The condition of the remains made identification difficult. The fire had burned hot enough and long enough to cause extreme damage. Dental records and forensic examination would eventually confirm that 2 of the bodies belonged to Mark and Irene Colthurst. During those examinations, something critical was discovered. X-rays revealed bullet fragments embedded in both of their skulls. The bullets were .22 caliber. Over the following days, additional remains were recovered from the wreckage. The body of 5-year-old Kimberly Colthurst was found, along with the remains of crewman Michael Stewart. Bone fragments and partial remains from 3 more individuals were eventually located. Dental records confirmed one set of remains as belonging to crewman Jerome Keown. The other 2 were assumed to be Dean Moon and Chris Heyman, though conclusive identification proved impossible due to the extent of the fire damage. The physical evidence told a clear story, even as it raised disturbing questions. Autopsy results showed that Mark and Irene Colthurst had died from gunshot wounds before the fire started. There was no carbon monoxide in their lungs, which would have been present if they had breathed smoke. Blood alcohol levels in the adults were elevated, consistent with an evening of celebration. The fire had been deliberately set. Accelerant patterns suggested gasoline had been used. Someone had attempted to sink the investor before burning it, opening the seacocks, valves that control water flow into the hull, in an apparent effort to flood the vessel. When that failed to sink the boat quickly enough, the perpetrator had returned with gasoline and set it ablaze. The timeline that emerged from witness statements and physical evidence suggested a methodical sequence of events. Sometime late on the evening of September 5th or in the early hours of September 6th, someone had boarded the investor while it was tied up at the Craig dock. That person had shot Mark and Irene Colthurst, likely as they slept. Whether the children and crew were killed at the dock or later was unclear, but the absence of carbon monoxide in the recovered remains indicated all 8 victims had died before the fire was set. At some point during the early morning of September 6th, while fog still covered the harbor, the killer had quietly untied the investor from the adjacent boats, carefully leaving the tie-down lines behind to avoid making noise that might alert nearby crews. The person had then piloted the vessel to Fish Egg Island, anchored it in deep water, opened the seacocks in an attempt to sink it, and returned to Craig in the investor's small skiff. When the fog lifted on the afternoon of September 7th and the investor remained visible, still afloat despite the open seacocks, the killer had apparently realized the sinking attempt had failed. Witnesses reported seeing a man in Craig purchasing approximately 2.5 gallons of gasoline from a local fuel supplier that afternoon. Shortly afterward, someone had taken a skiff back out to the investor, spread the gasoline throughout the interior, set the fire, and returned to the Craig docks. Multiple witnesses reported seeing this person, a man operating the investor's skiff during both trips to Fish Egg Island. The descriptions varied significantly, which would later create enormous problems for the investigation. Some witnesses described a white male in his late teens or early 20s, between 5 feet 9 inches and 6 feet tall, weighing approximately 160 pounds, with dirty blonde or light brown shoulder-length hair, pockmarked skin, and black rectangular framed glasses. Other witnesses described someone middle-aged or Alaska native. Several noted that the person seemed comfortable with boats, moving with the casual confidence of an experienced fisherman rather than someone unfamiliar with marine vessels. Based on the most consistent witness descriptions, Alaska State Troopers developed a composite sketch. It depicted a young white male matching the general description provided by several witnesses. The problem was immediately apparent. In a town of 600 people that swelled to include hundreds of seasonal fishermen during the summer, the composite could describe dozens of young men who had been in Craig in early September 1982. The investor murders represented the largest mass homicide in Alaska history, and from the beginning, investigators faced extraordinary challenges. The crime scene had literally gone up in flames before anyone realized a crime had been committed. Physical evidence that might have provided definitive answers, fingerprints, additional ballistic evidence, biological material from the killer, had been destroyed. The murder weapon was never recovered. The motive was unclear. There had been no apparent robbery. Valuable equipment aboard the investor remained in place. There were no signs of drug involvement, despite the fact that the commercial fishing industry in Alaska had its share of substance use and trafficking. What investigators did have were the bullet fragments from Mark and Irene Colthurst's skulls. forensic evidence that gasoline had been used as an accelerant, the testimony of witnesses who had seen someone operating the investor's skiff, and an awareness that whoever committed these murders had demonstrated both maritime skills and a chilling level of calculation. Over the next 2 years, Alaska state troopers conducted an exhaustive investigation. They interviewed dozens of people in Craig and in Bellingham, Washington, where many of the fishermen working in Craig spent their off-seasons. They followed hundreds of tips called into a hotline established specifically for the case. A $15,000 reward was posted for information leading to an arrest. Investigators developed a working theory. The murders had most likely been committed by someone who knew Mark Colthurst, someone who had a grievance against him, perhaps a former crew member or business associate. The methodical nature of the crime, the careful timing, the attempt to sink the boat, the return to burn it when sinking failed, suggested someone familiar with maritime operations and comfortable navigating the area. As the investigation progressed, police initially considered the possibility that one of the crew members might have been responsible, perhaps fleeing Craig aboard another fishing vessel immediately after the crime. This theory was gradually eliminated as remains were identified and as witnesses provided information about crew whereabouts. Attention shifted to people who had known Colthurst but weren't aboard the Investor that night. By the summer of 1984, investigators had narrowed their focus. Among the various individuals they had interviewed and re-interviewed, one name kept surfacing: John Kenneth Peel. Peel was 24 years old in September 1982. He fit the physical description from the composite sketch reasonably well. He was a white male in his early 20s with light-colored hair. He had been in Craig on September 5th and 6th, working as a crewman aboard another salmon boat called the Libby 8. He had previously worked for Mark Colthurst and had been fired, reportedly for alcohol and drug issues. He had dated Irene Colthurst's sister in a relationship that ended poorly. Several witnesses reported seeing Peel and Mark Colthurst interacting at Ruth Ann's restaurant on the evening of September 5th, their first encounter since Peel's firing the previous year. Other witnesses claimed they had seen Peel purchasing gasoline in Craig on the afternoon of September 7th, though these accounts were inconsistent and contradicted by other testimony. Some witnesses said they had seen Peel operating a skiff around the time the investor was moved to Fish Egg Island. In June 1984, investigators interviewed Peel extensively. They were hoping for a confession, believing that without one, the circumstantial nature of their evidence would make prosecution difficult. Peel denied any involvement in the murders. He acknowledged being in Craig, acknowledged knowing the Colthursts, acknowledged the difficult ending of his employment with Mark Colthurst and his relationship with Irene's sister. But he maintained he had nothing to do with the crimes. Peel also failed multiple polygraph examinations, though polygraph results are generally not admissible in court due to their unreliability. He had called the tip line established for the case at least twice, which investigators viewed as suspicious behavior, though it could also be interpreted as the actions of someone with information trying to help or someone anxious about being under suspicion. The case against Peel was entirely circumstantial. There was no physical evidence linking him to the investor on the night of the murders. There was no murder weapon. There was no definitive motive. Being fired from a fishing job and having a romantic relationship end badly seemed insufficient to explain the massacre of 8 people, including 2 small children. But investigators believed they had enough to proceed. On September 10, 1984, almost exactly 2 years after the murders, John Kenneth Peel was arrested in Bellingham, Washington, where he had settled after the 1982 fishing season. By then, he was married with a young son, working as a shipbuilder. He was charged with 8 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of arson, held on $1 million bail. If convicted, he faced life in prison. The arrest made headlines throughout Alaska and the Pacific Northwest. For a case that had generated intense public interest and frustration, it seemed like a resolution might finally be approaching. The families of the victims, who had endured 2 years without answers, expressed cautious hope that justice might be served. But building a case strong enough for conviction would prove to be a very different matter than making an arrest. The first trial began in January 1986 in Ketchikan, Alaska. The prosecution was led by Mary and Henry, an experienced prosecutor convinced that despite the circumstantial nature of the evidence, the accumulation of witness testimony and Peel's connections to the victims would be sufficient for a conviction. The defense was handled by attorneys who immediately focused on the weaknesses in the state's case. The lack of physical evidence, the absence of a credible motive, the conflicting and unreliable nature of witness testimony, and the fact that the composite sketch could describe numerous young fishermen who had been in Craig in September 1982. The trial lasted approximately 6 months, an extraordinary length for any criminal proceeding. During that time, more than 150 witnesses testified, all of whom had to be flown or transported to the remote location at the state's expense. The prosecution presented more than 800 pieces of evidence. The cost of the trial approached $2 million, making it one of the most expensive prosecutions in Alaska history. Witness testimony became the central battlefield. Some witnesses testified they had seen Peel in locations that would support the prosecution's timeline. Others testified they had seen him in different places at different times, creating alibis that contradicted the state's theory. Several witnesses acknowledged having substance abuse issues or criminal histories, which the defense used to challenge their reliability. Memory itself became a problem. Witnesses were testifying about events that had occurred 4 years earlier, often about brief glimpses of people in foggy conditions or darkened areas. The malleability of human memory, the way details can shift or be influenced by suggestion over time, created significant doubt about the accuracy of identifications. The defense also highlighted investigative failures. The initial crime scene had been allowed to burn for hours before being secured, destroying potential evidence. The investor itself had eventually been towed and then sank approximately 6 miles from Craig, putting any remaining physical evidence permanently out of reach at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. Witness interviews had been conducted over an extended period, during which witnesses could have influenced each other's memories or been influenced by investigators' questions. In her closing argument, Prosecutor Mary and Henry made a striking claim. The state didn't need to prove a definitive motive, didn't need to explain exactly how Peel had managed to kill 8 people in the confined space of a fishing boat without alerting nearby vessels, didn't need to produce a murder weapon, and didn't need physical evidence. According to Henry, witness testimony alone was sufficient to convict. The defense attorney, John Widener, rejected this argument. Without a convincing motive, without a murder weapon, without physical evidence, and with unreliable and contradictory witness testimony, the state had failed to meet its burden of proof. On August 28, 1986, after 6 days of deliberation, the jury informed Judge Thomas Schultz that they were hopelessly deadlocked. They had re-listened to dozens of hours of testimony during their deliberations but couldn't reach consensus. One juror later told reporters the jury had leaned toward acquittal, splitting roughly 7-5 in favor of a not guilty verdict, though the exact breakdown varied on different counts. The result was a mistrial. The state of Alaska refused to accept the mistrial as the end of the case. Prosecutors remained convinced that John Peel was responsible for the murders, and in January 1988, a second trial began. It would become Alaska's longest-running criminal prosecution and its most expensive, with the state spending an additional $700,000 beyond the costs of the first trial. The second trial followed similar patterns to the first. The prosecution presented its case again, arguing that witnesses had seen Peel in the skiff, purchasing gasoline, and interacting with the Colthursts shortly before the murders. The defense again emphasized the lack of physical evidence, the absence of a coherent motive, and the unreliability of witness identifications. By this point, witnesses were testifying about events that had occurred more than 5 years earlier, and the defense effectively demonstrated how memories had shifted, how details had changed, how certainty about identifications had wavered. The second trial lasted 3 months. After 4 days of deliberation in April 1988, the jury returned with a verdict: not guilty on all counts. John Kenneth Peel was acquitted. The acquittal left everyone involved with the case in a state of profound dissatisfaction. For the families of the 8 victims, it meant that more than 5 years after losing their loved ones, no one would be held accountable. The Colthurst family, the families of the 4 young crewmen, they had endured 2 long trials, had watched their private grief become public spectacle, and were now left with the knowledge that the case would almost certainly never be resolved. Lori Hart, Mark Coulthurst's sister, would later speak about the enduring pain of having no closure, no answers, no justice for her brother, his wife, their children, and the 4 young men who died with them. For law enforcement and prosecutors, the acquittal was equally frustrating. Mary and Henry stated publicly after the verdict that, in her view, the state knew who the killer was but had been unable to convince the jury beyond reasonable doubt. She invoked the principle that it's better to let guilty people go free than to convict an innocent person, but maintained her conviction that Peel was responsible. David McNeil, a Washington state police detective involved in the investigation, would later say the acquittal represented a prosecutorial failure rather than evidence of Peel's innocence. For John Kenneth Peel, the acquittal provided legal vindication but not social exoneration. He had spent nearly 4 years under intense scrutiny, his life suspended between arraignment and trial, his reputation destroyed, his name forever associated with one of Alaska's most notorious crimes. Even acquittal couldn't fully restore what had been taken from him. In 1990, Peel filed a civil lawsuit against the state of Alaska, seeking $150 million in damages for malicious prosecution and the years of his life consumed by defending himself against charges he maintained were unfounded. During preparation for the civil case, Peel's attorneys uncovered internal documents suggesting that investigators had recognized early on that their case was circumstantial and that without a confession, successful prosecution would be extremely difficult. The state eventually settled the lawsuit in 1997 for $900,000, a tacit acknowledgement that the prosecution had proceeded despite significant evidentiary weaknesses. In 2017, the Alaska Department of Public Safety officially declared the case closed. Though closed in this context doesn't mean solved. According to Tim Despain, a spokesman for the Alaska State Troopers, law enforcement continues to believe that John Peel was responsible for the murders, despite his acquittal. Peel, now in his 60s, continues to maintain his innocence. In interviews, he has expressed frustration that despite being found not guilty by 2 separate juries, public suspicion continues to follow him. He has said that until the case is truly solved, his name will never be fully cleared. The investor murders remain a wound that has never healed for multiple communities. In Blaine, Washington, where the Coulthurst family and the 4 crewmen came from, the annual blessing of the fleet ceremony includes a moment of remembrance. Lori Hart places 5 flowers in the water, 1 each for her brother Mark, his wife Irene, and their children Kimberly and John, and 1 for Michael Stewart. The families of Jerome Keown, Dean Moon, and Chris Heyman carry their own private grief, memories of young men who went to Alaska for a summer job and never came home. In Craig, Alaska, the case remains part of the town's collective memory. For older residents, it represents a moment when their isolated community was thrust into national attention for the worst possible reason. The investor murders changed the way people in Craig thought about safety, about trust, about the idea that their remoteness offered protection from the kind of violence that plagued larger places. Brittany Rutherford, an independent journalist who made the investor murders the subject of her master's thesis in anthropology at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, has created a photo exhibit called Lost at Sea, remembering the victims of the F/V investor murders. The exhibit focuses entirely on the 8 people who died, deliberately excluding any images or information about John Peel or the trials. The intent is to remember the victims as people rather than as names in a case file. To humanize Mark and Irene Coulthurst, to remember Kimberly and John as children who should have had full lives ahead of them, to honor the 4 young men whose futures were stolen. Author Leland Hale, who covered the case extensively and wrote a book about it titled What Happened in Craig, has suggested that there are people in the fishing community who know more about what happened that night than they've ever shared publicly. Small communities keep secrets, and the culture of commercial fishing in Alaska has always had an element of insularity, a reluctance to cooperate with law enforcement, a code of handling problems internally. Whether such knowledge exists, and whether it will ever surface, remains an open question. The case raises difficult questions about memory, evidence, and justice. How reliable are eyewitness identifications, especially when they occur in poor lighting, in foggy conditions, and are recalled years after the fact? How much circumstantial evidence is sufficient to convict someone of mass murder? What happens when investigators focus so intently on a single suspect that they may overlook other possibilities? The investor case demonstrates how a crime can remain technically unsolved even when authorities are convinced they know who committed it, how the legal standard of proof beyond reasonable doubt can create a gap between institutional certainty and judicial accountability. There are those who believe John Peel was guilty and that the two juries made mistakes, overwhelmed by the complexity of the evidence and unable to see the pattern that investigators believed was clear. There are those who believe Peel was innocent and that he became a convenient scapegoat for investigators desperate to solve an unsolvable case. There are those who believe the truth is more complicated, that perhaps the killer was someone who has never been publicly identified, someone who left Craig immediately after the murders and has lived with that secret for more than 40 years. What remains undisputed is the loss itself. 8 people died violently. 2 children who should have grown up in Blaine, Washington, who should have attended school, made friends, lived ordinary lives, were killed before they had a chance to understand what was happening. For young men, barely out of high school, working a summer job that should have been the start of adult independence, were murdered for reasons that remain unclear. A young couple, building a business and a family, were shot while sleeping on their own boat. An unborn child died with its mother, never drawing a breath. Somewhere, someone knows what happened aboard the Investor during the early morning hours of September 6, 1982. Whether that person is still alive, whether they've carried the weight of that knowledge for decades, whether they've ever felt compelled to confess or share what they know, these questions remain unanswered. The fog that covered Craig, Alaska, that September morning has never fully lifted. The image of a man waving casually from the deck of a boat filled with bodies continues to haunt those who remember, a gesture that contained both terrible truth and perfect deception, ordinary enough to be forgotten in the moment but impossible to forget once its meaning became clear. The Investor itself rests at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, somewhere off the coast of Craig, carrying whatever secrets the fire didn't consume. The families of the victims carry their grief, permanent and private. John Peel carries the burden of suspicion, regardless of legal vindication. The case file remains open in the sense that no one has been convicted, closed in the sense that no active investigation continues. And in the harbor at Craig, fishing boats still come and go with the seasons, their crews working the same waters, facing the same dangers, living the same transient life that brought the Investor to that dock on September 5, 1982. The rhythms of the fishing life continue, but the memory persists. A reminder that isolation is not the same as safety, that violence can find its way to even the most remote places, and that some mysteries remain unsolved not because answers don't exist, but because finding them requires more than investigation can provide. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story to help you drift off to sleep. Now, let's move on to our third story. Story 3. The Town That Chose Silence. On a summer morning in 1981, a man sat in his pickup truck on the main street of a small Missouri town. More than 40 people stood nearby. Within minutes, he was dead. Shot multiple times in broad daylight. No one called the police immediately. No one performed CPR. And when investigators arrived, not a single witness could remember seeing anything at all. This is the story of Skidmore, Missouri, and the killing that still divides opinion more than 4 decades later. Skidmore sits in the northwest corner of Missouri, tucked into Nottoway County, where the land rolls gently and the population has never exceeded a few hundred souls. In 1981, it was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where families had lived for generations, where the same names appeared on mailboxes and gravestones alike. Main Street consisted of a handful of businesses: a tavern, a pool hall, a grocery store, the D&G Tavern where farmers gathered after morning chores. The nearest hospital was 30 miles away. The county sheriff's department was understaffed and stretched thin across rural roads that seemed to lead nowhere in particular. Life moved slowly here, governed by harvest seasons and Sunday services. People left their doors unlocked. Children rode bicycles until dusk without supervision. It was a community built on unspoken agreements, about neighborliness, about minding one's business, about handling problems quietly before they became public embarrassments. Ken Rex McElroy was not from one of the old families, though he'd been around Skidmore nearly all his life. Born in 1934, he was one of 16 children raised in poverty in the surrounding area. He left school in 8th grade, married young, and eventually settled into a pattern that would define the next 3 decades. Intimidation, theft, and a remarkable ability to avoid meaningful consequences. McElroy stood over 6 feet tall, barrel-chested, with a presence that commanded attention. He rarely smiled. He wore cowboy boots and drove a Silverado pickup truck, often with a rifle visible in the rear window. He bought and sold livestock, though questions always lingered about where those animals had come from. Farmers reported hogs missing from their pens. Cattle vanished from pastures. McElroy always seemed to have something to sell, and he always had cash in his pocket. But it wasn't the suspected thefts that terrorized the community. It was the pattern of retaliation that followed whenever someone dared to accuse him. A farmer who reported missing livestock might find his barn burned to the ground weeks later. A store owner who confronted McElroy about unpaid bills might discover his tires slashed. His windows shot out in the middle of the night. McElroy had been charged with crimes numerous times over the years: assault, statutory rape, theft, intimidation. Yet he walked away from nearly every charge. His lawyer, a skilled Kansas City defense attorney named Richard McFadden, specialized in continuances, procedural challenges, and the exploitation of every technicality available under law. Witnesses changed their stories. Victims chose not to testify. Evidence mysteriously disappeared. McElroy had been arrested more than 20 times, but he'd spent only 1 night in jail. He understood that fear was more powerful than any jail cell. That a man willing to drive slowly past your house at 3 in the morning, or to follow your daughter to school, could control your behavior more effectively than any judge. The town watched and stayed silent. What else could they do? Law enforcement seemed powerless. The judicial system produced no accountability. Speaking out only brought danger closer to your own doorstep. So people looked away. They crossed the street when they saw him coming. They accepted that Ken McElroy existed outside the normal rules that governed everyone else. By the late 1970s, McElroy had divorced his second wife and taken up with Trenna McLeod, a girl he'd met when she was barely a teenager. He'd been charged with statutory rape, but Trenna refused to testify against him. Eventually, while charges were still pending, they married. She was 16. He was in his mid-40s. Trenna became a constant presence at his side, silent and watchful, a young woman who seemed to have learned the same lessons about survival that the town itself had absorbed. The McElroys lived on a property outside town, in a house surrounded by junk vehicles and livestock pens. They came into Skidmore regularly, to the tavern, to the grocery, to the pool hall. And everywhere they went, an invisible boundary formed around them. People turned away. Conversations stopped. The air itself seemed to change. But underneath that enforced quiet, something was building. Resentment accumulated like water behind a dam, silent, invisible, and under increasing pressure. Farmers whispered to each other about losses they couldn't prove. Store owners calculated debts they couldn't collect. Mothers warned their daughters to stay away from certain places at certain times. The town functioned, but it functioned around an open wound that wouldn't heal because it couldn't be acknowledged. Then, in July 1980, something changed. The boundary was crossed in a way that couldn't be ignored. Ernest Bo Bowenkamp was 70 years old, a grocer who'd run the Skidmore market with his wife Lois for decades. He was respected, soft-spoken, and well-liked, the kind of man who extended credit to families who were struggling, who knew everyone's children by name. One afternoon, Trina McElroy came into the store with her children. There was an accusation. Lois Bowenkamp believed one of the children had attempted to take candy without paying. Words were exchanged. Trina left angry. What happened next followed a pattern the town knew too well. Ken McElroy arrived at the store. There was a confrontation with the Bowenkamps. Then, over the following days, the harassment began. McElroy drove past the store repeatedly, sometimes parking across the street for hours, staring. He followed Bo Bowenkamp when he made deliveries. He made comments that were just ambiguous enough, warnings that weren't quite threats, observations that carried implications. The Bowenkamps did something almost no one else had done. They pressed charges. McElroy was charged with assault. But before the trial could proceed, the situation escalated in a way that finally cracked the town's silence. On July 8, 1980, as darkness fell, Bo Bowenkamp stepped out of his store. A shotgun blast tore through the evening quiet. Bowenkamp collapsed, wounded in the neck. Witnesses identified Ken McElroy as the shooter. This time, there was no ambiguity, no question of proof. McElroy was arrested and charged with felonious assault. But even then, the pattern held. McElroy posted bond. He returned to town, and as the trial date approached, he made it known. Through gestures, through words spoken in the tavern, through the simple fact of his presence, that there would be consequences for anyone who testified against him. Bo Bowenkamp survived his injuries, but he was 70 years old and facing a man who had never accepted limits. The trial finally occurred in June 1981. McElroy was convicted and sentenced to 2 years in prison, the first real conviction of his life. But his attorney immediately appealed. McElroy remained free on bond while the appeal proceeded. The pattern continued. Justice once again was delayed. The town had watched a man shoot another man in front of witnesses. They'd watched him convicted, and they watched him walk free anyway, returning to the same streets, the same tavern, the same routine of intimidation. Something fundamental had broken in the unspoken agreement that held the community together. If the law couldn't protect a 70-year-old grocer who'd been shot in his own town, who could it protect? People began talking carefully at first in private conversations behind closed doors. What could be done? Who could they turn to? The sheriff's department had done everything legally possible. The prosecutor had secured a conviction. But McElroy was still there, still free, and now he had even more reason to retaliate. The Bowenkamps had been warned to leave town, to disappear before McElroy's appeal succeeded and he returned permanently. Other families began to consider the same thing. How did you live in a place where fear governed every decision? On July 10, 1981, word spread through Skidmore that there would be a town meeting at the Legion Hall. It wasn't formally organized. There were no official notices, but everyone understood what the meeting was about. They'd tried the law. They'd tried silence. Nothing had worked, and now something had to change. The morning of July 10th was hot and clear, the kind of Midwest summer day when humidity settles over everything like a heavy blanket. Skidmore woke to its usual rhythms. Coffee brewing in farmhouse kitchens, livestock needing attention, the early morning quiet that came before the day's work truly began. But underneath the ordinary surface, something different was moving through the town. People who'd barely spoken to each other in months found reasons to stop and talk. The phrase, "the meeting," passed between them without elaboration. Everyone knew. The American Legion Hall sat on a quiet street, a modest building that hosted community gatherings, anniversary parties, and Friday night bingo games. By mid-morning, it had become clear that this would not be an ordinary gathering. Pickup trucks began arriving before noon, parking along the street in a way that suggested their owners intended to stay a while. Men came alone or in small groups, their expressions difficult to read. Some brought their wives. No one brought children. The Legion Hall's interior was simple: folding chairs, a small bar area, walls decorated with American flags and photographs of local veterans. As people filtered in, the room filled with a particular kind of silence. Not the comfortable quiet of neighbors who knew each other well, but something heavier and more purposeful. Farmers who typically spent their afternoons in fields sat shoulder to shoulder. Business owners who rarely left their shops stood against the walls. Approximately 60 or 70 people crowded into a space that suddenly felt too small. The meeting had no formal agenda, no official leader. The mayor attended, along with the county sheriff. Various townspeople spoke, their voices careful and measured, articulating what everyone already knew. Ken McElroy had terrorized their community for years. The legal system had failed to stop him. The shooting of Bo Bowenkamp had proven that no one was safe. Something had to be done. Sheriff Dan Estes listened and then explained one more time what everyone had heard before. His department had arrested McElroy numerous times. Prosecutors had brought charges. But McElroy had a skilled attorney and understood how to exploit legal procedures. Unless someone witnessed a crime and was willing to testify, and to face the consequences of that testimony, there was little more law enforcement could do. The sheriff's words, though factually accurate, offered no comfort. They were an admission that official channels had been exhausted. The meeting continued for perhaps an hour. There was discussion of organizing patrols, of creating some kind of citizen watch. There was talk of approaching McElroy directly, of attempting negotiation or mediation. But underneath these surface suggestions, another conversation was happening. One conducted in glances and silences, in what wasn't said rather than what was. At some point, the meeting ended without a clear resolution. People began filing out into the bright afternoon sunlight. Ken McElroy had not been oblivious to the gathering. He'd learned about it just as he learned about everything in Skidmore. That morning, he'd driven into town with Trenna, parking his Silverado in front of the D&G Tavern on Main Street. He'd spent time inside, visible through the windows, making his presence known. He was sending a message, as he'd always done. That he was not intimidated, that he would not be pushed out, that whatever people said behind closed doors didn't matter because he was still here. When the meeting at the Legion Hall concluded, many of those who'd attended walked the short distance to Main Street. The D&G Tavern was the natural gathering place. The spot where farmers always ended up after business was concluded. But on this particular day, that gathering took on a different character. People congregated outside on the street rather than going in. They stood in clusters, talking quietly. The crowd grew 30 people, then 40, then more. Main Street, which was rarely busy even at its busiest, filled with townspeople. Ken McElroy emerged from the tavern and climbed into his pickup truck, Trenna beside him in the passenger seat. He sat there, engine off, door open, his presence a challenge. He'd done this before, positioned himself as the center of attention, daring anyone to act. It was a familiar dance. He intimidated and people looked away. But this time, no one looked away. The crowd remained. They stood on the sidewalk, on the street, near their own vehicles, silent, watching. The air felt different, charged with something that had been building for years and now pressed against the boundaries of normal behavior. What happened next occurred in broad daylight, in front of witnesses on a public street. Yet the exact details have remained disputed for more than 40 years, protected by a silence more complete than any legal privilege. Shots rang out. Multiple shots from at least 2 different weapons. The rear window of McElroy's truck shattered. Ken McElroy was hit multiple times, struck in the head and neck. Trenna McElroy ducked down, unharmed but terrified, as bullets tore through the vehicle's cab. The shooting lasted only seconds, an explosion of violence that ended as quickly as it began. McElroy slumped forward. Blood spread across the truck's interior. The crowd that had been standing nearby moments before seemed to evaporate. People moved toward their own vehicles, engines started, trucks began pulling away from curbs. No one ran, no one screamed. The exodus was quiet and orderly, as if everyone had simultaneously remembered pressing business elsewhere. Trenna McElroy, 19 years old and in shock, stumbled from the truck. She looked around at faces she recognized. People she'd seen in the grocery store, at church, on these same streets her entire life. No one met her eyes. No one approached to help. She ran toward the tavern, screaming for someone to call for help. The ambulance arrived from outside town, its sirens breaking the silence that had settled over Main Street. Paramedics found Ken McElroy dead in his truck, his body showing multiple gunshot wounds. They found Trina hysterical and a street that had somehow emptied of the dozens of people who'd been present minutes before. A few remained, standing at distances that suggested they'd just arrived, their expressions carefully neutral. Sheriff Estes reached the scene quickly. He'd been aware of the town meeting, aware of the tensions building in Skidmore. But awareness hadn't translated into prevention. Now he faced a crime scene in the middle of Main Street, a dead man, and a community that had instantly closed ranks in a way he'd never encountered before. The investigation began immediately. Estes called for backup from state authorities. FBI agents eventually became involved, given the circumstances of a broad daylight killing with numerous potential witnesses. Investigators went door to door, interviewing everyone they could identify as having been in town that day. They asked for statements, for cooperation, for anyone willing to describe what they'd seen. And they encountered a wall of silence more impenetrable than any lack of evidence could create. People remembered being at the meeting at the Legion Hall. They remembered walking to Main Street afterward. But when it came to the actual shooting, their memories became uniformly unclear. Some claimed they'd gone into buildings just before it happened. Others said they'd been looking in different directions. Several admitted to hearing shots but couldn't say where they'd come from. Not a single person could or would identify a shooter. Trina McElroy provided the only detailed account. She claimed to have seen who fired the shots, to have recognized faces in the crowd. But without corroborating evidence, without forensic confirmation, her testimony alone wasn't enough to bring charges that would survive legal scrutiny. Investigators found shell casings but no weapons. They identified trajectories but no shooters. The physical evidence proved a killing had occurred but pointed toward no specific individuals. The silence wasn't passive. It was active, deliberate, and coordinated in a way that suggested unspoken agreement. Neighbors who'd lived next to each other for decades suddenly couldn't remember details they'd normally recall perfectly. Business owners whose shops faced Main Street had somehow all been in back rooms or distracted at the crucial moment. The town had collectively decided that Ken McElroy's death would remain unsolved, and they maintained that decision with a unity that seemed almost choreographed. In the days following the shooting, media attention descended on Skidmore. Reporters from newspapers and television stations arrived to cover what they called a case of frontier justice or vigilante killing. They interviewed townspeople who expressed no remorse, no shock, sometimes barely concealed relief. The Bowenkamps, the elderly couple whose shooting had precipitated the final crisis, gave careful statements to reporters. Bo Bowenkamp said what many others felt, that Ken McElroy had terrorized them for years, that the legal system had failed, that they'd been left with no options. He didn't condone murder, he said, but he understood it. The national media coverage created its own pressures. Skidmore became known as the town that killed its bully, a label that flattened the complexity of decades of fear into a simple narrative. Television producers descended on Main Street, reconstructing events, interviewing anyone willing to talk. Most weren't willing. The attention was unwelcome, an invasion that felt as threatening as McElroy's presence had been, just in a different way. Prosecutor David Baird faced an impossible situation. He had a dead man, a hysterical widow, and a community that had decided to become collectively blind and mute. He convened a grand jury, hoping that the formal legal process might break through the wall of silence. For weeks, townspeople filed through the courthouse, raised their right hands, swore to tell the truth, and then proceeded to remember nothing useful. The grand jury process dragged on, consuming resources and producing no indictments. Skidmore returned to its routines, but the shooting had changed the town's fundamental character. Some residents felt shame at what had happened, believing that mob justice violated the principles they claimed to uphold. Others felt relief that had nowhere to go. They couldn't celebrate a killing, but they couldn't pretend they mourned the victim either. The division ran through families, between neighbors, creating fractures that would never fully heal. Children asked questions their parents struggled to answer. What had happened to Mr. McElroy? Why wouldn't anyone talk about it? The silence that had protected the town also poisoned it, creating a shared secret that became its own kind of burden. People who'd witnessed the shooting, or who knew who'd pulled the triggers, carried that knowledge in isolation, unable to speak about it even to those closest to them. The investigation continued for months, then years. Federal authorities maintained interest, considering charges that might circumvent local resistance. But time worked against them. Memories became genuinely hazy as months passed. The distinction between what people actually remembered and what they decided not to remember blurred into something indistinguishable. Evidence degraded. Potential witnesses died or moved away. The case grew cold not because it lacked attention, but because an entire community had chosen to let it freeze. The seasons changed, and Skidmore tried to move forward. Main Street looked the same. The same storefronts, the same tavern, the same quiet that had always characterized a town where nothing much ever happened. But the normality was constructed now, performative. Everyone knew what lay beneath it. Trenna McElroy left town shortly after her husband's death. She took their children and moved away from Nottoway County, away from the streets where she'd been present when her husband was killed, away from neighbors who'd watched it happen and turned away from her afterward. She filed a wrongful death lawsuit against the town, the sheriff, and several individuals she believed were involved. The suit sought damages for the loss of her husband, for the trauma she'd endured, for what she described as a conspiracy to commit murder. The lawsuit wound through the legal system for years, becoming another forum where Skidmore's silence was tested. Depositions were taken. Witnesses were questioned under oath. But the wall held. People testified that they hadn't seen anything, didn't know anything, couldn't help. The lawsuit was eventually dismissed, not because the court approved of what had happened, but because Trenna McElroy couldn't meet the legal burden of proving who had done it. Justice, once again, was denied through technicalities and absence of evidence. Ken McElroy's attorney, Richard McFadden, gave interviews defending his deceased client. McElroy, he insisted, had been entitled to legal representation, to every protection afforded under law. That he'd avoided conviction wasn't evidence of a broken system but proof that the system had worked, that prosecutors couldn't prove their cases beyond reasonable doubt. But McFadden's arguments, legally sound as they might be, rang hollow in a community that had lived with the consequences of those acquittals. The law had protected McElroy's rights so thoroughly that it had left everyone else vulnerable. The grand jury concluded its investigation without returning any indictments. Prosecutor Baird issued a statement acknowledging that the killing would likely remain unsolved. He noted carefully that this wasn't the outcome the legal system was designed to produce, that a community shouldn't have to choose between living in fear and taking justice into their own hands. But his words were an epitaph for a case that was already dead. Federal authorities maintained their investigation longer than local prosecutors could. FBI agents continued conducting interviews, reviewing evidence, looking for any crack in the collective silence. They examined whether civil rights charges could be brought, whether there'd been a conspiracy that crossed state lines, whether any federal statutes had been violated. But ultimately, they faced the same obstacle. Without witnesses, without physical evidence linking specific individuals to the shooting, there was no prosecutable case. By the mid-1980s, even federal interest had waned. Skidmore found itself the subject of books, documentaries, and academic studies examining what happened when communities felt abandoned by legal institutions. Criminologists and sociologists analyzed the case as an example of vigilante justice. Though that phrase never quite captured the complexity of what had occurred. This hadn't been a mob lynching in the traditional sense. There'd been no rope, no midnight raid, no theatrical violence. Instead, it had been something quieter and more disturbing, a community that had collectively decided to stop cooperating with rules that didn't protect them, and had done so in a way that was both organized and deniable. The town's residents gave interviews over the years, and their words revealed the moral complexity of their situation. Many insisted they weren't proud of what happened. They hadn't wanted someone to die. But they also wouldn't apologize for refusing to help prosecutors identify who'd done it. Ken McElroy had made their lives miserable for decades. The law had failed them repeatedly. When pressed to condemn the killing, most simply fell silent. The same silence that had protected the shooters protected the community's conscience. Bo and Lois Bowenkamp lived the rest of their years in Skidmore. Bo recovered from his gunshot wound physically, though he never fully recovered from the knowledge that he'd nearly been killed on his own street. He didn't celebrate McElroy's death, but he also didn't pretend to mourn it. In interviews years later, he was careful with his words, acknowledging the tragedy of violence while noting the relief that came from no longer living in constant fear. Lois was more direct. They'd had no choice but to press charges after the shooting, and they'd paid for that decision with years of terror. She didn't condone murder, but she understood why no one wanted to talk about it. Other families had their own reckonings. Parents had to explain to children what had happened and why the adults in their lives had responded the way they did. Some families left Skidmore, unable to live with the knowledge of what had occurred or their own role in maintaining silence. Others stayed, accepting that this was now part of their town's identity, a permanent stain that couldn't be washed away but perhaps could be lived with. The sheriff's department faced criticism for failing to prevent the killing despite clear warning signs. Sheriff Estes defended his actions, noting that he'd arrested McElroy numerous times, that prosecutors had brought charges, that every legal avenue had been pursued. What more could law enforcement have done? Station a deputy outside McElroy's house permanently? Arrest people for standing on a public street? The criticism implied there'd been obvious preventive measures, but no one could articulate what those measures would have been within the constraints of constitutional law. Prosecutors, too, faced difficult questions. Why had Ken McElroy walked free so many times? The answer involved technicalities, witness intimidation, and a legal system that prioritized defendant rights over victim protection. McFadden's aggressive defense strategies had been legal and effective, but they'd also created a situation where a man who terrorized a community faced no meaningful consequences until that community decided to create its own. The case became a teaching example in law schools, not of how the system should work, but of what happens when it doesn't. The philosophical questions raised by the case had no clean answers. Was killing Ken McElroy murder, or was it self-defense by a community that had exhausted every other option? If the law can't or won't protect people, do they retain some natural right to protect themselves? At what point does prolonged intimidation become a form of violence that justifies a violent response? These weren't abstract debates. They were questions that Skidmore's residents lived with daily. Some argued that what happened in Skidmore was precisely what the rule of law was meant to prevent: the descent into mob justice where power rather than principle determined outcomes. If communities could simply kill people they deemed threats, then no one was safe and society reverted to a state of barbarism. The fact that Ken McElroy had been a genuine threat didn't justify his killing. It justified better legal mechanisms for dealing with such threats. Others countered that the rule of law had already failed in Skidmore. The legal system's protections for defendants had been weaponized by McElroy to victimize an entire community. When institutions don't fulfill their basic function of providing security, people will create their own security mechanisms. The killing was tragic, but it was a symptom of systemic failure rather than simple bloodlust. Both perspectives contained truth, and the tension between them couldn't be resolved. Skidmore became a test case for questions about justice that are as old as organized society. Who gets to enforce rules? What happens when official enforcement fails? How do communities balance individual rights against collective security? Years passed, then decades. The people who'd stood on Main Street that July morning grew older. Some took whatever they knew to their graves. Others spoke carefully in later interviews, acknowledging presence but not participation, acknowledging understanding but not approval. The details remained protected by layers of silence that only grew harder to penetrate as time passed. Ken McElroy's widow, Trenna, rebuilt her life elsewhere. She remarried and tried to create distance from the trauma of that day. In occasional interviews, she spoke about her late husband with a complexity that defied simple narratives. Yes, he'd had a temper. Yes, he'd been difficult. But he'd also been her husband, the father of her children, and she'd watched him killed in front of her, while people she knew stood by and did nothing to help. Her perspective, as the only eyewitness willing to speak, added a dimension to the story that was easy to forget in discussions about justified violence and community protection. The case produced no winners. Ken McElroy was dead. His family was traumatized and displaced. Skidmore gained an unwanted national reputation. Law enforcement's limitations were exposed. The legal system's failures were documented. And the people who'd lived through it carried the burden of what had happened for the rest of their lives, unable to talk about it freely, unable to escape it completely. More than 40 years have passed since that July morning. Skidmore remains a small town in northwest Missouri, its population even smaller than it was in 1981. Main Street looks different now. Some businesses have closed, others changed hands, and the D&G Tavern where Ken McElroy spent his last hour is long gone. But the story remains, passed down through generations, discussed in documentaries and true crime forums, studied by people interested in what happens when formal justice systems encounter informal community power. The case has become a cultural reference point, invoked whenever discussions arise about vigilante justice or community safety. It appears in criminology textbooks as an example of extralegal punishment. It's discussed in ethics classes exploring the boundaries of justifiable violence. It's referenced in political debates about the proper scope of law enforcement. The killing in Skidmore has transcended its specific circumstances to become a symbol, though people disagree about what exactly it symbolizes. For some, it represents the natural consequence of a broken legal system. Ken McElroy exploited every procedural protection available to defendants, using the law as a shield to protect his criminal behavior. His attorney was skilled and aggressive, understanding that in the American legal system, the burden of proof rests on prosecutors, and that burden can be manipulated through continuances, witness intimidation, and careful procedural challenges. The case demonstrates what happens when legal protections designed to prevent wrongful conviction become tools for avoiding all conviction, regardless of guilt. From this perspective, Skidmore's response wasn't an abandonment of law, but a recognition that law had already abandoned them. The townspeople had reported crimes, pressed charges, testified when they could, and cooperated with authorities for years. They'd done everything citizens are supposed to do in a functioning legal system. When that system repeatedly failed to protect them, they made a choice between continued victimization and extralegal action. That the law later couldn't solve McElroy's killing seemed like poetic justice. Prosecutors faced the same frustration of witnesses who wouldn't cooperate that they'd experienced when trying to convict McElroy. Others view the case as a cautionary tale about the dangers of mob justice and the erosion of legal principles. Regardless of McElroy's behavior, he was entitled to due process. His convictions had to meet legal standards of proof. His rights as a defendant weren't technicalities. They were fundamental protections that exist precisely to prevent communities from deciding that someone deserves to die. Once a community arrogates to itself the right to kill someone it deems a threat, there's no principle limiting that power. Today, it might be someone who genuinely terrorized people. Tomorrow, it might be someone who simply offended the wrong individuals. The rule of law exists to prevent such descents into arbitrary power. From this perspective, Skidmore's silence after the killing wasn't principled resistance but obstruction of justice. People witnessed a murder and refused to cooperate with investigators. That some might feel McElroy deserved it doesn't matter. Justice requires treating even unsympathetic victims fairly. The town's collective decision to protect the shooters set a precedent that undermined the legal system's ability to function. If witnesses only cooperate when they approve of prosecutions, then the entire framework of criminal justice collapses. Both interpretations contain elements of truth, and the case's enduring fascination lies partly in its resistance to simple moral conclusions. The people of Skidmore weren't bloodthirsty vigilantes or noble defenders of justice. They were ordinary people pushed into an extraordinary situation by the failures of institutions meant to protect them. Academic researchers have studied the case extensively. Sociologists have examined it as an example of informal social control, the mechanisms communities use to enforce norms when formal institutions fail. The consensus that formed in Skidmore that day, and the silence that followed, represented a form of collective action that revealed how communities actually function beneath the surface of official rules. People didn't need explicit plans or coordinated instructions. They understood through shared experience and unspoken communication what was happening and how to respond to it. Criminologists have analyzed the case in the context of victimization and systemic failure. Ken McElroy's pattern of behavior constituted prolonged community victimization. His ability to avoid consequences despite numerous arrests highlighted weaknesses in how the legal system handles sophisticated offenders who understand procedural protections. The case raised questions about whether new legal mechanisms were needed to address situations where individuals use the system itself as a weapon against their communities. Legal scholars have examined the case's implications for witness protection and prosecutorial discretion. McElroy's success in intimidating witnesses demonstrated that the criminal justice system depends on people being willing to participate, and that participation requires safety. Without robust witness protection, without consequences for intimidation, the system becomes vulnerable to exactly the kind of manipulation McElroy practiced. The failure to convict him repeatedly wasn't just about legal technicalities. It was about a system that couldn't protect its own participants. Writers and filmmakers have been drawn to the case for decades. Multiple books have documented the events, each approaching the story from different angles. Some focus on Ken McElroy himself, attempting to understand how a person develops into someone capable of terrorizing an entire community. His childhood poverty, limited education, and early experiences with violence shaped him, but many people face similar circumstances without becoming predatory. What specific factors produce someone like McElroy remains a question without definitive answers. Other accounts focus on the townspeople, exploring how ordinary individuals respond when placed in impossible situations. The farmers, shopkeepers, and families of Skidmore weren't heroes or villains. They were people trying to survive. Their collective silence after the killing revealed something about human nature and community bonds that's difficult to articulate but impossible to ignore. In extreme circumstances, people sometimes prioritize loyalty to their immediate community over abstract principles of justice, especially when those principles seem to have already failed them. The question of who actually pulled the triggers has never been definitively answered. Over the years, various names have been whispered, various theories proposed. Some claim to know exactly who was responsible and why. Others insist that the specifics don't matter, that what happened was a community action rather than individual crime. A few people have given deathbed confessions or late-life interviews hinting at involvement, but none have provided details that could be legally verified. This ongoing uncertainty serves a purpose for Skidmore. As long as no one knows exactly who was responsible, everyone shares the burden equally. The silence protects specific individuals, but it also protects the community as a whole from having to divide into those who killed and those who merely witnessed. The ambiguity allows the town to maintain unity around what happened while avoiding the fractures that specific identifications might create. Trenna McElroy's perspective remains important but often overlooked in discussions of the case. She was 19 years old when she watched her husband killed. Whatever Ken McElroy's crimes, she was a victim that day, of violence, of abandonment, of a community that closed ranks against her. Her attempts to find justice through lawsuits failed. Her testimony was dismissed. Her trauma was minimized in favor of narratives about justifiable community action. The complexity of her situation, simultaneously victim and accomplice, witness and pariah, reflects broader questions about how we assign moral weight to different people's experiences. The Bowenkamps lived the rest of their lives in Skidmore, testimony to the fact that not everyone fled from what had happened. Bo died in 1998, Lois some years later. They'd remained part of a community that had, in some sense, avenged the violence done to them. But they'd also lived with the knowledge that their hometown had become famous for a killing, that their private trauma had become public spectacle. The price of safety had been higher than anyone could have anticipated. Modern Skidmore continues to grapple with its history. Tourism related to the case brings some attention and occasional visitors, though the town hasn't embraced or commercialized its notoriety. residents still decline to speak about the killing with outsiders. The collective silence that formed in 1981 persists, maintained by new generations who understand that some things aren't discussed. It's become part of the town's identity, not the killing itself, but the agreement not to talk about it. Law enforcement training now includes discussions of the McElroy case as an example of what can happen when communities lose faith in official justice. Police academies use it to teach about the importance of witness protection, consistent prosecution, and maintaining community trust. The case demonstrates that law enforcement isn't just about catching criminals. It's about ensuring that communities believe the system works and that cooperation will be rewarded rather than punished. Prosecutors' offices study the case as a cautionary tale about the limits of defendant rights. McElroy's ability to exploit legal protections raised questions that remain relevant. How do you balance defendants' rights against community safety? When does vigorous defense cross the line into obstruction? How do you prevent intimidation without compromising the right to confront accusers? These questions don't have easy answers, but the McElroy case provides a stark example of what happens when the balance tips too far toward procedural protection at the expense of substantive justice. The case also highlights broader questions about rural America and the relationship between small communities and distant legal institutions. Skidmore's population was too small to support extensive local law enforcement. The county sheriff's department was understaffed and covered a large geographic area. Court proceedings happened in county seats miles away, presided over by judges and prosecutors who didn't live in the communities most affected by their decisions. This distance created a gap between formal legal outcomes and local realities, a gap that Ken McElroy exploited and that ultimately led to his death. There's a particular tragedy in the fact that the system finally convicted McElroy shortly before his death. The June 1981 conviction for shooting Bo Bowenkamp represented a breakthrough. Prosecutors had secured a verdict, a judge had imposed a sentence, and the legal system had finally produced the accountability the community had sought for decades. But McElroy remained free pending appeal, and that freedom proved fatal. If he'd been immediately incarcerated, if the appeal hadn't allowed continued liberty, he might be alive today. The case illustrates how the lag between conviction and punishment can have irreversible consequences. 40 years later, the questions raised by Ken McElroy's death remain unresolved. Was it murder or community self-defense? Were the townspeople criminals or victims? Did the legal system fail, or did it work exactly as designed, just too slowly? Should anyone have been prosecuted for the killing? Or was the community's silence a justifiable response to institutional abandonment? These questions don't have clear answers because they involve competing values that can't be easily reconciled. The rule of law matters, due process matters, but safety matters too. Community cohesion matters. At some point, abstract principles encounter concrete realities, and the collision produces outcomes that resist simple moral categorization. Skidmore's story forces confrontation with uncomfortable truths about justice and society. Systems designed to be fair and protective can become vehicles for abuse when exploited by people who understand their weaknesses. Communities that pride themselves on law-abiding behavior can become capable of extralegal violence when pushed beyond certain boundaries. The silence that follows collective action can be both protective and corrosive, holding people together while poisoning relationships with shared secrets. Ken McElroy has been dead for more than 40 years. No one has been charged with his killing. The investigation remains technically open but effectively dormant. Skidmore continues as a small Missouri town where most people know each other and where Main Street is quiet on summer mornings. To an outsider driving through, nothing would indicate the town's complicated history. But for those who live there, for those who remember, the weight of what happened remains. Unspoken, unresolved, and unforgotten. The case endures because it asks questions we still haven't answered about justice, community, and the limits of law. It reminds us that systems only work when people believe in them, and that belief is fragile. It demonstrates that fear can push ordinary people to extraordinary actions, and that those actions carry consequences that echo for generations. On July 10, 1981, in broad daylight on a public street, a man was killed while dozens of people watched. And in the silence that followed, Skidmore chose to protect its own over cooperating with a system that had failed to protect them. Whether that choice was right or wrong may depend on where you stand, on which side of that invisible line between formal justice and survival, between law and community, between what should be and what is. Some secrets remain buried not because they're forgotten, but because remembering them too clearly would require confronting questions that have no comfortable answers. Skidmore's silence is one of those secrets, preserved, protected, and passed down as a reminder that justice sometimes comes at costs too high to calculate, and that the space between right and wrong is wider and darker than most people want to acknowledge. The sun rises each morning over the rolling hills of northwest Missouri. Life continues in Skidmore, and the town that chose silence carries its burden still, 40 years later, with no end in sight and no clear path to resolution. That, perhaps, is the real legacy of Ken McElroy's death. Not the killing itself, but the weight of what comes after, when justice and injustice become so entangled that no one can separate them anymore. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. Now let's get into our final story. Story 4 break time equals 0. 5s/, the town that killed in broad daylight. In the summer of 1981, a man was shot to death in the middle of Main Street. Dozens of people watched it happen. No one called the police. No one spoke his name. And to this day, no one has been charged with his murder. Skidmore, Missouri sits in the northwest corner of the state, tucked into farmland that rolls toward the Iowa border. In 1981, fewer than 500 people lived there. Everyone knew everyone. Doors stayed unlocked. Children played in the streets until dark. It was the kind of place where a handshake meant something, where your word was your bond, and where the community looked after its own. Ken McElroy was not one of their own. He was born in 1934, the 15th of 16 children in a family that drifted through the poorest edges of rural Missouri. He dropped out of school after 8th grade. By his early 20s, he had a reputation. Livestock went missing from farms. Equipment disappeared. McElroy always seemed to have something to sell, and no one could quite prove where it came from. He was suspected of rustling hogs and cattle across 3 counties. He was suspected of arson, assault, and statutory rape. Over the course of 3 decades, Ken McElroy was accused of more than 20 felonies. He was convicted of almost none of them. McElroy had learned how to work the system. He hired talented lawyers. He intimidated witnesses. People who agreed to testify would find him sitting in his truck outside their home at night, engine idling, headlights on. He carried a rifle in a rack behind his seat and a pistol on his hip. He would follow people to church, to the grocery store, to their children's school. He never said a word. He didn't have to. Witnesses changed their stories. Charges were dropped. Trials were postponed, again and again, until witnesses gave up or moved away. The law, it seemed, could not touch him. By 1980, McElroy had been married multiple times, though some of those relationships began when the girls were still in junior high. He fathered at least 15 children. He lived in a house on the outskirts of town with his latest wife, Trenna, a woman he had been involved with since she was 14. He drove a Silverado pickup truck. He drank at the Legion Hall and the D&G Tavern. And everywhere he went, he brought fear with him. The people of Skidmore were tired. They were farmers, shop owners, laborers. They believed in the law, but the law had failed them over and over. And in the summer of 1981, that failure would finally push them past the point of return. Ernest Bo Bowenkamp ran the only grocery store in Skidmore. He was 70 years old, a quiet man with a steady reputation. He and his wife Lois had served the town for decades. Their store was small, modest, stocked with canned goods and necessities. It was the kind of place where people stopped not just to shop, but to talk, to check in, to remain connected. In July 1980, Bo Bowenkamp asked Trina McElroy to stop letting her children take candy without paying. It was a reasonable request. It should have been a small moment. But Ken McElroy did not tolerate being challenged. Not even indirectly. He began showing up at the store, standing outside, leaning against his truck, staring through the windows. Bo tried to ignore it. Lois grew nervous. Customers stopped coming by as often. Then, on the evening of July 8, 1980, McElroy confronted Bo on the street outside the grocery. Witnesses said he was loud, aggressive. Bo, elderly and slight, tried to walk away. McElroy followed. Then he pulled a shotgun from his truck and fired. The blast hit Bo in the neck. He collapsed on the sidewalk, bleeding, in front of his wife and neighbors. Miraculously, Bo survived. He spent weeks in the hospital. McElroy was arrested and charged with assault with intent to kill. For the first time in years, it seemed the system might finally hold him accountable. The prosecutor was confident. The evidence was strong. There were witnesses. McElroy went to trial, and in June 1981, a jury found him guilty. He faced up to 15 years in prison. But McElroy's attorney filed an appeal and requested bail. The judge agreed. McElroy walked out of the courthouse a free man while his case wound its way through the system. He returned to Skidmore. He returned to the D&G Tavern. And he made it clear that he was not finished. He began driving past the Bowenkamp home at all hours. He sat outside the grocery store again. He told people in town that when his appeal was over, Bo Bowenkamp would be dead. He said it plainly, without hesitation, as if it were already decided. Lois Bowenkamp stopped sleeping. Bo kept a gun by the door. The sheriff's office said there was nothing more they could do unless McElroy committed another crime. The town was suffocating under the weight of it. Families talked quietly about leaving. Others talked about something else. On July 10, 1981, the Nottoway County prosecutor and the local sheriff agreed to attend a meeting at the American Legion Hall in Skidmore. The topic was Ken McElroy. The question was simple. What could be done? More than 40 people attended. They filled the chairs and lined the walls. The prosecutor explained the legal situation. The appeal would take time. Until then, McElroy was free. The sheriff acknowledged the frustration but urged patience. He said they had to trust the process. Then he and the prosecutor left the meeting. What happened next was discussed only in silence. The men stayed behind. They talked among themselves. No one recorded what was said. But when they left the Legion Hall that day, something had shifted. The weight had not lifted. It had simply been redistributed. July 10, 1981 was hot and still. Ken McElroy spent the morning drinking at the D&G Tavern with Trina. It was a Friday, and Main Street was quiet in the way small towns are quiet during the middle of the day. A few trucks parked along the curb. The tavern sat across from the post office and the bank. Everything in Skidmore was within a few blocks. Everything was visible. Around 10:30 in the morning, McElroy and Trina left the tavern and walked to his Silverado, parked directly outside. McElroy climbed into the driver's seat. Trina sat beside him. He lit a cigarette. The windows were down. The engine was off. It is unclear whether he intended to leave or whether he was simply sitting there, as he often did, making his presence known. What happened next took less than a minute. Somewhere between 30 and 45 people were on Main Street or nearby. Some had been in the tavern. Others had been at the Legion Hall. Still others appeared from storefronts, from trucks, from the post office. They moved without speaking, without hurry. They formed a loose perimeter around the Silverado. No one shouted. No one gave a signal. Then someone fired. The first shot came through the rear window of the truck. Then another. Then several more. Witnesses later said they heard between 5 and 10 shots, though some said more. The gunfire was loud and brief and final. McElroy slumped forward against the steering wheel. Trina, sitting beside him, was not injured. She screamed. She looked out at the crowd. She would later say she recognized faces. She would later say she saw rifles. The shooting stopped. The street went silent. People walked away. Slowly, Without panic, they returned to their trucks, their shops, their homes. No one ran. No one lingered. Within minutes, Main Street was nearly empty again. Trenna sat in the truck beside her husband's body. She waited. Eventually, someone called for help. The sheriff arrived, then an ambulance, though there was nothing to be done. Ken McElroy was dead. He was 47 years old. The investigation began immediately. The Missouri State Highway Patrol, the FBI, the county sheriff all descended on Skidmore. They interviewed more than 40 people who had been present. Every single one of them claimed they had not seen anything. They did not know who fired. They did not see weapons. They were looking the other way. It was impossible, the investigators said, that no one saw anything. But the silence held. Trenna McElroy was the only person willing to name names. She identified several men she said were in the crowd. But her testimony alone was not enough. There was no physical evidence tying any individual to the shooting. No murder weapon was ever recovered. No charges were ever filed. The case remains open, technically unsolved. But everyone in Skidmore knows what happened. They simply chose not to say it. In the weeks following Ken McElroy's death, reporters flooded Skidmore. National news outlets called it vigilante justice, frontier law, a breakdown of civil order. Legal scholars debated whether the town had committed murder or self-defense. Ethicists argued about the morality of collective violence. But the people of Skidmore did not participate in those debates. They closed ranks. They stopped answering questions. They went back to work. A grand jury was convened. Testimony was heard. Evidence was examined. In the end, no indictments were issued. The prosecuting attorney cited a lack of cooperation from witnesses and insufficient evidence. Trenna McElroy filed a wrongful death lawsuit against the town, the county, and several individuals. It was eventually settled out of court. No one was found guilty. No one went to prison. In the years since, a few people have spoken cautiously about what happened that day. Some have suggested it was a spontaneous act, a moment of collective fury that no one had planned. Others have said it was discussed, coordinated, inevitable. Del Clement, the town marshal at the time, told a reporter years later that he had been present but declined to elaborate. Others have taken their knowledge to the grave. There is a moral tension in this story that cannot be easily resolved. The legal system failed the people of Skidmore repeatedly. Ken McElroy terrorized families, threatened lives, and evaded justice for decades. He was a violent man who created real fear. But what happened on Main Street was not law. It was not trial. It was execution, public and irreversible. Some see it as a necessary act by a desperate community with no other option. Others see it as a dangerous precedent, a moment when ordinary people decided they were entitled to take a life. Both perspectives carry weight. Both resist easy dismissal. Skidmore is still there, quieter now, smaller. The D&G Tavern is gone. The grocery store is gone. Fewer than 300 people live there today. Main Street is lined with empty buildings and faded paint. But the story endures. Journalists still visit. Podcasters still ask questions. Filmmakers still try to find someone willing to talk. The silence remains. Ken McElroy's grave is in the St. Joseph Memorial Park Cemetery. It is simple, unremarkable. Trenna McElroy eventually remarried and moved away. Bo Bowenkamp lived for another 2 decades and died peacefully. The men who were on Main Street that day went on with their lives. They raised families. They farmed. They grew old. And they kept their secrets. What happened in Skidmore was not justice in the legal sense. But it was an ending. A town trapped by fear found a way to free itself. And in doing so, crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed. There is no resolution that satisfies everyone. No neat conclusion. Only the question that remains, quiet and persistent, like a weight that never fully lifts. What would you have done? The law is meant to protect us. But when it fails, when it falters, when it looks the other way, what is left? In Skidmore, Missouri, in the summer of 1981, the answer came not from a courtroom or a jury, but from a street full of neighbors who decided they had waited long enough. and then they went silent. Thank you for watching and being part of this dive into the dark and fascinating stories that keep us all on edge. If you enjoyed the ride, remember to like, subscribe, and share with others who crave a good mystery. Tell us where you're watching from. I love knowing where in the world our true crime family is tuning in. Your presence means a lot. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and keep digging into the shadows where truth and mystery meet.